Obviously I'm not an audiovisual professional. My boyfriend actually is. So if you're watching the live stream, hun, back from Minnesota, I'm not trying to do any live demos that require the internet. I know that's the #1 rule of conference Wi-Fi. It's always going to be a problem. So my name is Bridget Kromhout. I do operations for a small social commerce startup in Minneapolis called 8th Bridge. I have a t-shirt. Today I'm going to talk about that stuff that Mitchell alluded to earlier when he started us off saying culture is important, but he's going to focus on the tools. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the culture. And to give you an idea of why I am the right person to talk to you about this, I've been a sysadmin for a long time, like long enough that I poured one on the curb for, SunOS 4.1.3. And some of you have nostalgia there. And I don't think I started out being this, horrible, rigid bureaucrat, right? I mean, I started out thinking, hey, in one of my earlier lives, one of my earlier incarnations, I worked for a giant telco, which shall remain nameless, because of what I'm about to tell you. So they had a 42-page change management process form that we were supposed to fill out if, as sysadmins, we wanted to do anything. But if it was an emergency, then we could just do whatever we wanted and then just fill out an emergency form later. One guess as to how many emergencies there were. So it's not that I was always all about process and bureaucracy, but for some reason over the years, as a sysadmin, I started saying no a lot, mostly to developers. How many developers are there in this room? Yeah, how many of you have ever had a sysadmin say no to you? Yeah, and the ones who haven't, you probably just don't have any systems people at your organization, right? And so that was not actually the best way to relate to developers. My previous gig before the startup that I'm at now, I was at an academic research institute for 7 years, and I ran a group of sysadmins and developers, but there were these other developers in the other team, the application developers, and I pretty much developed this attitude that they were an especially dangerous breed of users, who under no circumstances should be allowed to do anything to production, because, think of what they would do to it. And a lot of that was a product of the time, the tooling. I mean, some of it was culture, but some of it was, oh gosh, we carefully hand-whittled these servers. What if the developers touch them? What if they tip over? Oh, there's this special Snowflake server that does this one thing, and some guy named Bob knows everything about it, and he has a bunch of bash scripts, and that's the only thing that can make that server keep working. Well, if we let the developers loose on it, what's going to happen? And I think that having that kind of problems in your organization, which I definitely contributed to from the sysadmin side, is what leads to these silos. I took this picture from Amtrak in North Dakota. I'm pretty sure that installation is some sort of fracking thing owned by Halliburton, but it sort of made me think of how separate dev and ops can be in different organizations. When I decided to go to a startup as their first ops hire, it was a big adjustment because, first of all, I was coming from a very we have LDAP and NFS and MySQL and whatever. I was coming from a more old school environment and jumping to a whole bunch of tools that were new to me. It's like AWS. After my first interview, I went and set up the free tier and tried it and then came back and said, yeah, okay, I've used it now. And they hired me, so. But a lot of this stuff was new to me. I was so used to thinking about protecting the servers from the local users because in an academic environment, if you have several thousand active accounts and maybe some of them are active under the names of someone who is not the person who's supposed to be using them, whether or not the original owner knows about this, you spend a lot of time worrying about local user privilege escalations. And going into a software as a service environment, you spend a lot of time worrying about your API endpoints. So it's a different set of worries, but what kind of data are we exposing there, that sort of thing. But it did lead me to suddenly need to adjust to dealing with everything from a developer point of view, since I joined a dev team as the only ops person to do, all the dev and the ops, mix your chocolate with your peanut butter. And I got to tell you, frankly, this was terrifying. I was scared because suddenly I'm out of my comfort zone. It's difficult. Change is hard, you guys. Change is difficult. And especially if you're used to being very comfortable in everything that you're doing and knowing everything that you're doing, it's really hard to change and learn that maybe some of the ways that you're doing things are not the only way or even the best way. So it is difficult and, made me feel like that. But they did hire me for a reason, right? There were a lot of things that the shoot from the hip developers, if you're watching guys, hi, a lot of things that they actually wanted someone to specifically focus on. All those things that the ops folks are known for. And the DevOpsy tools are a great way to get a lot of these things done. Yes, I do now write enough Python to use Bodo, or maybe a little more, and enough Ruby to use Chef. I still tell Python to use bash stuff from time to time. I use subprocess. I'm not totally evil. But it was really, I feel very lucky that I adjusted to a DevOpsy sort of way of working in this team of people that were fine with not forcing me to start using Sublime Text or whatever. It's like, okay, I'm happy in VI. I want to use it. And they're like, oh, but PyCharm is great. But you know what? As long as I'm committing to the same, repos, et cetera, it doesn't necessarily matter. So again, you've got your pillars of DevOps or whatever. I have a lot of trouble with the pillars thing just because that makes me think that they're all separate. And I don't actually see these as separate things because the culture makes a big difference to how all of the rest of this plays out in your organization. So I don't know, I see it as like one giant pillar, one giant CN tower. You've got your sharing right there. If you ever go up the CN tower in Toronto and stand on the plexiglass platform, you can look down. So yay, culture, let's have a touchy-feely culture talk and glitter bomb you with DevOps. It actually does matter, but not because DevOps will just be something that you can, open the Pandora's box of and it makes your organization happy and better. It's more that when I was a sysadmin and they were the developers and we were fight, we weren't necessarily working to the same goals. We were working towards the goals of our small subset of the organization, not the goals of the whole organization. And the DevOps mindset is, yes, you're actually working towards the goals of the whole organization. And what I mentioned before about tools, okay, yes, of course you need to use your source control and your group chat and whatever. But if I want to use IRC or Vim or whatever, that's not the end of the world as long as we get the same end result. Again, I think in DevOps stuff, in DevOps circles, we focus a lot on tools, and they are important. But you also saw that, again, in Mitchell's slides, there were a lot of different tools that can work together to do different things, or the same things. And as long as your organization is on the same page when it comes to, you have group chat, you're going to use, you can use IRC or Campfire or HipChat, or I hear Slack is the new hotness. Is anyone here using Slack yet? Yeah, okay, so is it the new hotness? It's pretty nice? Okay. I don't know, we moved from IRC to HipChat, and I don't know, maybe Slack, we'll see. But anyway, so if you have the one person on your team who you have to go over on Skype or on Google Chat or whatever to talk to them because they're not on the group chat with everyone, that's a huge problem. But which group chat your organization is using, that doesn't really matter, right? Feature-wise it might matter, but as long as you're actually doing this stuff, the tool is not the most important thing. And we use Chef. There are plenty of other choices to use for your infrastructure as code piece, but the important part is so that you don't have that special Snowflake server where the dude named Bob is the only person who understands it. Because I'm sure, and I've never actually worked with anyone named Bob that I can recollect, but I'm sure that all of you are aware of this metaphorical Bob person where you're like, oh, you're a terrible blocker, the Brent from the Phoenix Project. And if your infrastructure is actually not documented in something that's hopefully correct, but actually reproducible from code, that's going to make a huge difference. So that's in your automation, but again, that's part of your culture too, since people have to actually buy into this. In the whole CAMS thing, the measurement thing is great. I assume most of you have probably read the Coda's Craft blog post about graphite and StatsD, which is what this quote is from. Ian actually lives in Minnesota, one of the few Etsy employees, or maybe only Etsy employees who does, but he came and gave a great talk about Etsy's culture of failure is always an option. And again, a lot of why they can move fast, and any organizations that want to act like that can move fast and actually accomplish stuff, is you know what you're doing because you're measuring it. And again, tools, not necessarily the most important thing. I do like Graphite and StatsD. I could talk about them at length, but I'm not going to because this is not a tools talk, and also everything is running long and you all want lunch. But anyway, just the idea of being able to actually measure stuff. But again, your organization has to actually buy into this, so it comes back to culture. The transparency thing was actually a big deal for me, going to a startup that had, much more open, they had a big board in the war room. They had a much more open exposure of the stuff that was happening in the development operation than you would see in some big companies, or some big companies, not all, or academia or whatnot. And that actually does make a huge difference. So you get your blameless postmortems and what have you. It does help a lot. This is a good example of something that we actually experienced a couple of weeks ago, is having this stuff up on the big board made it really, really obvious coming in one morning that we had noticed that I've removed any identifying details to protect the guilty. We had a client whose third-party provider of other services clearly messed with how our stuff was being delivered to the client. And the purple stuff is what the traffic had looked like the previous day, what it should have looked like. The green stuff is what happened that morning. This is the sort of thing where, yes, you could get really fancy with some anomaly detection, but would you have really thought to set thresholds for these specific problems? Well, on the graph, it was very, very obvious that something is very wrong and has been turned off. And our client success person was able to get on the phone immediately with the, relevant parties and get this cleared up. You can obviously see right where it was cleared up. But this is the sort of thing that having that kind of information out in public that people like client success can look at makes a huge difference to the transparency and also communication in your organization. And also, again, Jeff Sussna has a really good blog post about empathy in DevOps, and I recommend everyone go read it. And I don't have a link to it here, of course, because that would be too helpful, but I'll put something on Twitter later. And the idea being that, yes, I might be heads down, focused on HBase this day, and yes, this front-end person might really be trying to get something to work for production with Node.js. And the idea of empathy is, yes, I care whether or not he's having a good day. So that's enough to make me care, even temporarily, about Node.js, which is saying a lot because, sysadmin. But the idea being that, yes, sometimes it's going to be difficult or aggravating to actually set aside the thing that you're working on if one of your colleagues has something else that they really need. But again, if DevOps are going to cooperate, you need to. And the other thing is, okay, we hear about the whole NoOps thing or whatever, and anyone who's in ops kind of laughs and go, good luck with that. But ops is changing. And you can't necessarily be a sysadmin the way you were a sysadmin, back when you were running SunOS and everything was super, and NIS had to come along because Sun's Yellow Pages was a thing. You can't necessarily operate exactly like that forever. As people were saying earlier today, this field's constantly changing. And Deming has a pretty good insight there. Yeah, okay. Winter isn't coming for that snowman. I mean, if you don't change, there's a storm sewer that would be perfectly happy to have you melt into it. But changing, probably a better option. So basically, it's been kind of an interesting, this has been about a year and a half for me, changing from being a really sysadmin who thought that developers were dangerous cowboys, shoot from the hip, probably shouldn't be allowed to touch anything ever, to person who cheerfully showed, the front-end guy in question how to kick off yet another chef run if he wants something updated in prod immediately. You have to have the humility to accept that you have to learn new things, but also you have to have just the attitude of the developers have a lot to offer. Their tools are really useful, and sysadmins and developers working together make stuff a lot better than working apart. So this is one day of DevOps in MountainWest Hack Week, which is pretty awesome, and I'm glad that they have it. And there are also Devops Days, which is 2 solid days of all DevOps stuff. And we're going to have one in Minneapolis, mid-July probably. We're still locking down the date, but we're still locking down the venue, but we should know very soon. And just devopsdays.org gives you a lot more information about stuff like this. And I've been to a couple of them, and they were really valuable and really interesting. Lots of tool stuff, also some culture stuff. A good mix. So anyway, so that's all I have in this particular talk. If you want to hit me up on Twitter, we can talk about dev or ops or commas and direct address, because details are important, and that's always driven me crazy. So yeah, that's my talk. Right.